if I told you that some of the most faithful people in the Bible were called rebels by the religious systems of their day? What if the woman you've been taught to admire, Esther, only saved her people because she broke religious protocol? What if the man who questioned the Pharisees to their faces, that formerly blind man we talked about, wasn't being disrespectful, but was actually speaking truth? Here's what I've discovered. What looks like rebellion to religious systems is often faithfulness to God. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is question the status quo, not because it's wrong, but because it exposes what's been wrong all along. Today, we're going to look at biblical heroes who defied religious authority, broke religious rules, and refused to bow to religious pressure. We're going to discover that their so-called rebellion wasn't rebellion at all. It was courage. It was faith. It was obedience to a higher authority. So if you've ever been called rebellious for asking questions, for speaking truth, or for protecting the vulnerable, settle in. This episode is for you. We are loyal Christian women. We've served. We've believed. We've stayed, even when it hurt. We gave our hearts to faith, hoping for closeness with God, inner joy, and a safe place to belong. But somewhere along the way, the closeness became distance. The joy became exhaustion. And the place that was supposed to feel like home didn't. I'm Debra on a mission to take back pure faith from everything that distorted it. In every episode, I'll help you name what happened, see what's keeping you stuck, and come home to a safe, loving God. Grab your tea, toss the rule book, and let's go. You know that feeling you've been trying to explain but don't have words for? That spiritual heaviness, that fear of getting it wrong. Well, I created a quiz that will finally help you name these things. You'll see which of the 12 hidden barriers of religious trauma might be keeping you anxious, disconnected, or feeling like you're never enough. And when you finish, you get my whole starter kit free. Everything you need to take your first gentle steps towards healing. Head to Religious Trauma Quiz and finally put words to what you've been feeling. The first time I questioned the spiritual leader I had trusted for decades, my hands were shaking. I had overheard him telling lies about me to my family. Lies about things I had supposedly said and done. And for the first time in my life, I knew I had to speak up. When I confronted him, he didn't deny the lies. Instead, he told me he had to create a false narrative to protect everyone. He said the falsehoods were necessary. And then he looked at me with what seemed like genuine concern and said, "You're being rebellious. This isn't Christ-like. You need to trust me and submit." For a moment, I almost believed him, because that's what I'd been taught my whole life. Questioning authority is rebellion. Speaking up is divisive. If you have a problem with leadership, you take it to God in prayer. You don't make waves. And then something rose up in me, a clarity I had never felt before. And I heard myself say, if telling the truth is rebellion, then I guess I'm a rebel. In that moment, I realized something that changed everything. Religious systems often call rebellion what God calls faithfulness. They label as divisive what God calls truth-telling. They punish as questioning what God calls discernment. And I realized I wasn't alone. Throughout Scripture, faithful people were called rebels by religious systems, simply because they honored God above human authority. People like Esther, like Mordecai, like the man born blind, like the Hebrew midwives, even like Jesus himself. They were all called rebellious, but they were actually just faithful to a higher calling. And maybe, I thought, so am I. Today I want to show you something that might give you courage you didn't know you needed. We're going to look at 4 different biblical examples of people who looked rebellious to religious systems, but were actually being faithful to God. And I want you to pay attention to the pattern you'll see. In each story, someone chooses to obey God rather than human religious authority. In each story, they're labeled as rebellious, divisive, or disrespectful. And in each story, God vindicates them. So let's dive in. Let's start with a story you probably know, the story of Esther. But I want you to see it through a different lens today. The story begins with Mordecai, a Jewish man who works at the king's gate in Persia. A man named Haman, described as an Agagite, a descendant of the Amalekites, who had been enemies of God's people for generations, is promoted to the highest position in the kingdom. The king commands that everyone must bow down and pay honor to Haman whenever he passes by. Everyone does it, except Mordecai. Day after day, as Haman walks past, everyone bows. Everyone except Mordecai. He refuses. Now, the other officers notice. They ask Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" And Mordecai tells them he's a Jew, meaning his allegiance to God supersedes his allegiance to any human authority, even a king. The officials report this to Haman, and Haman is furious, not just angry, filled with rage. How dare this Jewish man refuse to honor him? But Haman doesn't just want to punish Mordecai. He wants to destroy all the Jewish people in the entire kingdom. So, he manipulates the king into signing a decree that on a certain day, all Jews throughout the kingdom will be killed. Now, here's the question. Was Mordecai being rebellious? Well, from the Persian government's perspective, absolutely. He was defying a direct royal command. He was disrespecting authority. He was causing division and conflict. But from God's perspective, Mordecai was being faithful. Because bowing to Haman, a man who represented everything opposed to God's people, would have been a betrayal of his identity and his God. Mordecai's refusal to bow wasn't arrogance. It was integrity. It was him saying, there are some things I won't do, no matter what human authority demands. Now enter Esther. She's Mordecai's cousin, and through a series of events, she becomes queen. But here's the problem. She's hidden her Jewish identity. The king doesn't know she's one of the people Haman wants to destroy. When Mordecai tells her about the decree and begs her to go to the king to plead for her people, Esther hesitates. Because there's a law. Anyone who approaches the king without being summoned can be put to death, unless the king extends his golden scepter. Esther sends a message back to Mordecai. I haven't been summoned to see the king for 30 days. If I go to him uninvited, I could die. And Mordecai sends back one of the most powerful messages in all Scripture. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying your position, your safety, your comfort, none of that matters if you stay silent while your people are being destroyed. Maybe God put you here precisely so you could speak up. So Esther makes a choice. She says, "Go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, day or night. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Even though it is against the law. Esther knew she was breaking protocol. She knew she was taking a huge risk. But she also knew that obeying God's call to protect her people was more important than obeying religious and royal protocol. And what happens? The king extends his scepter. Esther pleads for her people. Haman's plot is exposed. The Jewish people are saved. All because 2 people, Mordecai and Esther, refused to comply with systems that would destroy God's people. All because they chose faithfulness over conformity. Sweet friend, if you've been called rebellious for refusing to bow to systems that misrepresent God or harm his people, you're in good company. Mordecai and Esther were called rebellious too, but God called them faithful. Remember the man we talked about in a past episode? The one who was born blind, healed by Jesus, and then interrogated by the Pharisees? Let's look at his story again, but this time focusing on what he did that religious leaders considered rebellious. After Jesus heals him, the Pharisees haul him in for questioning. They want him to denounce Jesus as a sinner. They want him to say that his healing was somehow illegitimate because it happened on the Sabbath. At first, he just tells his story. The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. But the Pharisees aren't satisfied. They keep pushing. They bring in his parents, try to intimidate them. When that doesn't work, they call the man back and demand, "Give glory to God by telling the truth. We know this man is a sinner." And here's where this formerly blind man does something extraordinary. He questions them. He says, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." They keep interrogating him. "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And the man gets bolder. "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Do you hear the sarcasm? The courage? He's basically saying, why are you asking the same questions over and over? Are you actually interested in the truth? Or are you just trying to trap me? This enrages the religious leaders. They hurl insults at him. "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." And then, this is my favorite part, the formerly blind man gives them a theology lesson. He says, "Now, this is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes." We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He's questioning their entire framework. He's saying, you claim to be the religious experts, but you can't even recognize the work of God when it's right in front of you? And you know what the religious leaders do? They get defensive. They say, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they throw him out. Now, from the Pharisees' perspective, this man was being rebellious. He was questioning their authority. He was challenging their interpretation. He was refusing to conform to their narrative. But from God's perspective, this man was being faithful. He was standing up for truth. He was refusing to lie to protect powerful people. He was using his own experience and reasoning to discern God's work. And Jesus, who'd been watching the whole thing, came and found him afterward, not to rebuke him for being rebellious, but to reveal himself to him fully. If you've been labeled rebellious for asking honest questions, for sharing your experience, for challenging narratives that don't align with truth, you're doing what this man did. You're being faithful, even when religious systems call it rebellion. Okay, let me tell you about two women now you might not have heard much about, but who show us something powerful about faithful rebellion. In the book of Exodus, the Israelites have multiplied in Egypt, and the new Pharaoh is threatened by their numbers. So he comes up with a plan. He calls in the Hebrew midwives, two women named Shiphrah and Puah, and gives them a direct order. He says, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. This is a direct order from the highest authority in the land. The king himself has commanded them to do this. But the text says the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. They feared God, not Pharaoh. God. When Pharaoh calls them back and demands to know why Hebrew boys are still being born, they give him an excuse. Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Now, we don't know if this was true or if it was a strategic deception to protect innocent lives. But we do know this: God blessed them for it. The text says, so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Let me be clear about what happened here. These women directly disobeyed the highest governmental authority in their land. They refused to follow orders. They probably even lied to protect innocent lives. And God blessed them for it. Why? Because there's a hierarchy of authority. When human authority commands us to do evil, to harm the innocent, to participate in injustice, to violate God's clear commands, then we must obey God rather than humans. The midwives knew this. They knew that no matter what Pharaoh commanded, they could not murder innocent babies. Their fear of God was greater than their fear of Pharaoh. From Pharaoh's perspective, they were rebellious subjects who defied royal orders. From God's perspective, they were righteous women who valued life over compliance. Now, if you've ever been told you're rebellious for refusing to participate in harm, for protecting the vulnerable, for saying no to systems that demand your complicity in injustice, you're standing where those midwives stood. And God sees your courage. He honors your refusal to comply with evil, even when it's commanded by those in authority. And finally, let's look at Jesus himself. Because if anyone was labeled rebellious by religious systems, it was Jesus. The religious leaders called him a Sabbath breaker for healing on the Sabbath, a blasphemer for claiming equality with God, a friend of sinners for eating with tax collectors and prostitutes, a deceiver for teaching differently than their tradition, demon-possessed when they couldn't explain his power, a threat to national security for supposedly leading people astray. They said he was divisive, that he was causing trouble, that he wasn't respecting authority, that he was leading good Jewish people away from proper religion. And in a sense, they were right. Jesus was disrupting their system. He was challenging their authority. He was teaching something different than their tradition. But he wasn't being rebellious. He was being faithful to his Father. Every time Jesus broke a Sabbath rule, it was to demonstrate God's true heart, that mercy matters more than ritual. Every time Jesus challenged religious leaders, it was to expose how they were misrepresenting God's character. Every time Jesus included the excluded, it was to show that God's love is bigger than religious boundaries. The religious system called him a rebel, but heaven called him faithful, obedient, the exact representation of the Father's heart. And here's what I want you to see. If they called Jesus rebellious for being faithful to God, they will call you rebellious too. When you question teachings that don't align with God's character of love, when you refuse to participate in systems that harm the vulnerable, when you speak up about abuse that's been covered up, when you protect yourself or others from spiritual exploitation, religious systems will call you rebellious, divisive, disrespectful, a troublemaker. But God might be calling you faithful, courageous, a truth teller, his daughter who finally found her voice. Do you see the pattern in all these stories? In each one, there's a conflict between human religious authority and God's true heart. In each one, someone has to choose. Do I obey the system, or do I obey God? In each one, they choose God, even when it costs them, even when it looks like rebellion, even when religious leaders condemn them. And in each one, God vindicates them. Not always immediately, not always in ways that restore their reputation with the religious system, but he vindicates them in what matters most. They stayed faithful to him. Mordecai and Esther saved God's people. The man born blind received spiritual sight along with physical sight. The Hebrew midwives received God's blessings and families of their own. And Jesus, though crucified by religious systems, was raised by God and given the name above every name. Here's what this means for you. If you've been called rebellious for being faithful to God above religious systems, you're in the best company imaginable. You're standing where prophets stood, where apostles stood, where Jesus himself stood. And one day, when all things are made clear, your faithfulness will be vindicated too. So here's your invitation this week. I want you to think about a time you were labeled rebellious for doing something you knew was right. Maybe it was asking a question that made people uncomfortable, setting a boundary that disrupted the status quo, speaking truth that exposed deception, protecting someone who was being harmed, refusing to participate in something that violated your conscience. And I want you to ask God, was I being rebellious, or was I being faithful? Because here's what I've learned. Religious systems often can't tell the difference, but God can, and he sees your heart. If you were honoring God above human authority, if you were protecting the vulnerable, if you were standing for truth, then you weren't rebellious. You were faithful. And maybe, like Mordecai told Esther, you were placed in your position for such a time as this. Maybe you're questioning, your boundary setting, your truth telling. Maybe that's not rebellion. Maybe that's your calling. I know what you might be thinking. Healing from religious trauma sounds overwhelming. What if it's too hard? What if I don't have time? What if it makes everything worse? Friend, I designed the Coming Home journey specifically for women who feel exactly like that. This isn't about reliving trauma or doing years of intense therapy. It's about gentle, bite-sized steps that honor your pace and your tender heart. Here's how we make it easy. New milestones are released just twice a month, giving you plenty of space to read, reflect, and apply without feeling rushed. Each milestone includes a video lesson, guided self-coaching, and community support. Everything you need in one peaceful, protected space. Then there are bi-weekly group coaching calls, where all the breakthroughs happen. We gently guide you through everything you need to know. You can dive into a deep coaching session or just be a mouse in the corner. It's all welcome here. You don't have to figure this out alone. You don't have to have it all together to start. You just need to be willing to take one small step at a time toward the freedom God always intended for you. We meet you exactly where you are, and we walk forward together. No pressure, no perfection required, just gentle, steady movement toward home. Visit thecominghomejourney.com and see how simple coming home can be. Sweet friend, if this episode gave you courage to stand for truth, even when it's called rebellion, would you share it? Someone in your life needs to know they're not being rebellious, they're being faithful. These last 4 episodes have given you language, shown you Jesus' heart, taught you about boundaries, and reminded you that faithfulness sometimes looks like rebellion to religious systems. My prayer is that you now have both clarity and courage. Clarity to name what happened and courage to step into the freedom God is calling you toward. Until we talk again, remember, you're not rebellious. You're not divisive. You're not disrespectful. You're faithful. And God sees you. He honors you. And He's so proud of your courage. Keep going, dear one. You're on the right path.